The major parties in the 2024 presidential election received a combined total of 150 million votes. That's over 75 million votes each. Now let's compare that to every other candidate that competed for presidency. They only received 3.1 million votes combined. That is 24 times less votes than the Democrats or Republicans. From the surface, this may seem like an undoubtable monopoly, but is it really as simple as that? Well, we're going to try to answer that in today's video, and also figure out why can't third parties win. When you first search up reasons why third parties can't win, one of the most salient reasons that you'll find is that the Electoral College and winner-takes-all systems are holding them back. A quick description of the Electoral College is that there are 538 electoral votes, and they are divided among all states by population, but every state gets a guaranteed of 2 electoral votes. These votes are the actual votes that go into deciding the president, and how the state chooses to give out their votes is by doing the popularity election among its population, and whoever wins gets the most or all electoral votes depending how the state decides to divide it up. Like I said, that was just a quick description of the Electoral College. It's more complicated than that. Anyways, the main problem that third parties have with the Electoral College is a winner-takes-all system, which means that a state gives all the electoral votes to the winner no matter what. So that means it's possible that someone gets 49% of the votes and gets no electoral votes in return. And this is the main problem that third parties have, because they get no representation. But do we really think this is the main reason? I don't think so, because for the winner-takes-all system to affect third parties is if they get enough votes, which they haven't been doing. And why do you deserve any representation at all? You are getting below 1% of the votes. And what are you going to do with that one electoral vote? Maybe you could get some representation, but I doubt it. So there has to be something else affecting third parties. Maybe it could be they aren't getting on the ballot, which brings us to our next topic, ballot access laws. As the name implies, there are laws that add requirements for candidates to be able to be put on the state's ballot, and they can vary by state. But most states require a certain number of qualified voter signatures on a petition of support to be put on the state's ballot, and this can vary from tens of signatures to hundreds of thousands of signatures. And third parties claim that states have purposely increased their signature requirements to exclude third parties. But are their claims true? In this article by Bernard Tamas and Matthew Hindman, they did a study on the number of third parties on the House ballot, and it showed the number of third parties on the House ballot has been increasing since the mid-1960s, even though the signature and vote requirements have been steadily increasing since the 1980s. But they also show another graph that reveals that the percentage of votes third parties receive hasn't recovered since the 1920s. So does this article prove that ballot access laws have little to no effect on third parties? I would agree it has little to no effect on House elections, but what do you see third parties promote for the most? It's the presidential election, which we're going to take a look at next. From the 2004 to the 2020 presidential elections, the number of registered third-party candidates has soared from 128 to 725 candidates, but these are people who just registered. Now let's see how many of them had ballot access in at least 35 states. I chose 35 because it felt like a reasonable number for someone who's running for president to have a decent chance of winning. But as we can see out of the average of the 453 registered third-party candidates, only about 2.4 will be on 35 or more state ballots. And we can also see a small decline in the number of third-party candidates every election. But this isn't definite, as this only includes 7 elections, because before the year 2000, it gets hard to find what candidates reach the 35 state threshold. I also looked at every state's signature requirements for the presidential ballot for the 2024 election and calculated roughly the average amount of signatures it would take for the major and minor parties and independents to get on a given state's ballot. And these are the results. For the major parties, they need an average of 4,000 signatures, and for minor parties and independents, they need a shocking 15,000 and 18,000 signatures. That is quadruple the number of signatures required for the major parties. Even if we remove the outliers like Texas and New York, third parties will still need 2,500 more signatures. This doesn't make sense to me. Why should a smaller candidate have to do more than the major parties who are already well established and well known? Should it be the other way around? So there's more minor parties on the ballot and thus more competition in the government? I get there's a reasonable response to limit the amount of people on the ballot. That's so bad. I do it to limit the people on the ballot. This doesn't make sense to me. Why should a smaller party have to do more? This doesn't make sense to me. This doesn't make sense to me. Why should a smaller party have to do more than the major parties who are already well established and well known? Shouldn't it be the other way around, so there's more competition on the ballot, and thus more competition in the government? I get there's a reasonable response to limit the amount of people on the ballot to limit voter confusion, but I think this one's gone too far. It's limited too much. As shown earlier, only two candidates, other than the major parties, got on the 2024 ballot. Couldn't we afford a few more? Like 4 or 5 more candidates on the ballot? And voter confusion ain't always too bad. It will at least force the voter to actually look into the candidates. And with this current political landscape seeming so divided, and with us constantly believing it's only a two-party system and will only always be two-party, it really makes that 15,000 requirement seem very difficult. And people aren't just going to switch to your political campaign out of the blue. You have to have a really good reason to. So doesn't that already limit the amount of people that could get on the ballot? I do believe that we need ballot access laws. I just think most states overdo it and purposely do it to limit competition. Another question you might ask is why isn't third parties trying to stop these biased ballot access laws? Well, they have tried. In 2020, New York raised its signature requirements from 50,000 to its current threshold 45,000 signatures for third parties. The Green Party and other third parties tried challenging this, but was struck down by the Supreme Court. RFK Jr. also tried challenging it, but was also struck down by the New York Supreme Court. Minor parties have consistently struggled with the Supreme Court, with them refusing hearings, ruling against them, and even flipping the wording of past court cases. This is brought up in this article by Dmitry Avisiv. He brings up the case William v. Rhodes, which was a case about if Ohio violated the 14th Amendment because of its signature deadline, requirements, and refusing to put the Socialist Labor Party and the American Independent Party on the ballot. The court sided with the parties, saying that it violated the 14th Amendment and gave the major parties a complete monopoly. But this ruling was flipped on its head just 3 years later during the Janess v. Fortson case. This case was about did Georgia violate the 1st and 14th Amendments by defining political parties as getting more than 20% of the votes, and anything else was a political body and thus had to get 5% of the votes to petition. The court ruled with Georgia, saying that, unlike Ohio, Georgia did not freeze the political status quo. It's crazy to me how they went from Ohio's ballot access laws being a complete monopoly to Georgia's being not even close. And the argument that it doesn't freeze the status quo, so it should be allowed, is a joke to me. As long as it slows the status quo, or slows third parties, it should not be added, because it still gives an advantage to the major parties, or any other thing in life that slows down its competition. But is it really that hard to believe that the Supreme Court is biased to the major parties, even though they were all added by one? Of course you're going to be biased to the party, because they were the ones that got you this highly sought after job. And this will have great effects on third parties, because they'll add stupid laws that will slow down third parties so their party will have a better chance of winning. VC brings up plenty more examples of the Supreme Court doing similar things in his article, which I'll link in the description if you want to read, and same with any other article I use. But I feel like the Supreme Court had to have more reasoning than it just not freezing the status quo, which I believe is a huge blunder of a statement. But I do believe that the Supreme Court definitely has a bias problem, but it's far from the only big problem in the US, which brings us to gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is one of the biggest problems in the US, with almost every state having some form of it. For those who don't know about gerrymandering, it's a manipulation of boundaries, many state districts, to favor one party in an election. Let me give you an example of this. Let's take 100 squares, 60 red and 50 blue. If we divided this up equally, red would get 6 districts and blue 4 districts. But now let's look at a gerrymandered one. Now, all of a sudden, red has won all the districts, misrepresenting the blue. We can even flip it so blue wins more districts than the red. This strategy has been employed in many states to keep the Democrats or Republicans in power. But gerrymandering doesn't also affect elections. It also affects how a party can function. As shown in this article, when a districting plan is biased against a party, its candidates contest fewer legislative seats and have a worse credentials when they do run, its donors contribute less money, and its voters are not as supportive at the polls. Indeed, these have grand effects on third parties, which can also help us explain why third parties get so little votes during the House and Senate election. But we also gotta realize that this isn't just a third party problem, it's a whole country problem, affecting any party that's biased against it, including the Democrats and Republicans. The problem comes with stopping gerrymandering, because only the extremes can really be safely identified, because anything less, it could get really hard to tell if it was on purpose or not, and can spark a hot debate because it could look completely gerrymandered to one person, but can look completely fine to another. So I don't think the US has a complete fix-all for all their gerrymandering problems. So third parties and parties biased against it will just have to deal for now. Tell me the last time you've seen a candidate's ad or billboard. I couldn't tell you, and I doubt you could have either unless you lived in one of these 3 states. But why do we see so little promotion for third parties? First of all, because advertisement's not cheap, with just a billboard in a good location costing tens of thousands of dollars a month. And second, with them being less known and people generally having less faith in them, that comes at a cost of less donations. But shouldn't there be a system in the government that helps support candidates' campaign funds? Yes, and it's called the Presidential Public Funding Program, but in fact, it gives more money to major parties than to minor parties, due to how the system is set up. They say that they will match at first $250 of each contribution from individuals that an eligible presidential candidate receives during the primary campaign. So basically, the more money a candidate gets in the primary election, the more money the government will give them. This is a system that rewards a party for popularity, when in fact it should be used the other way around, to help support parties that need the money to help promote themselves better. This poor system design literally continues to the next line, where they straight up say they fund the major party nominees' general election campaign, while only assisting minor party nominees' campaign. And we're not even done. This continues to the funding for general election, where major parties are given grants, which in 2024 was $123.5 million. But for minor parties, they are only stated to receive partial election funding. They both have spending limits and other requirements, but the key difference from these two is that major parties aren't allowed to use private funds while minor parties can. They probably added this knowing, well, that even with outside funding, third parties will still not get enough money. But I can almost guarantee that the major parties have found a loophole in this, with the use of super PACs, which are committees that may receive unlimited contribution from anyone for the purpose of financing independent expenditures and other independent political activities. But most of the time, these committees just collaborate with the candidate, ask what they want them to do, and they go do it. Oh, and I forgot to mention the government's definition of a third party, which is a political party whose presidential candidate in the preceding presidential election received 5% or more, but less than 25% of the total number of popular votes received by all candidates for such office. To me, this is one of the worst definitions ever, because anyone you define as a third party, like the Green Party or Libertarian Party, doesn't count as a third party in the government's eyes. So, everything we just went over for public funding of presidential elections, they have not been able to apply for, because they haven't got 5% votes. In fact, a third party candidate hasn't gotten 5% votes since '92. And to only receive partial what major parties get is insane to me. To me, the public funding of presidential elections is one of the most biased systems in the government that obviously favor the major parties. But it isn't as biased as the presidential debates. Presidential debates are some of the most watched events in the US besides from sports, with just the 2024's debate between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump amassing 67 million views. And this doesn't just stop there, with people turning into videos and live streams about the debate as well. So no wonder it's single-handedly the best promotion for candidates. Yet again, they make it super difficult for third parties to get on the debate stage. The Commission on Presidential Debates, or CPD for short, run the debates, and they require you to get at least 15% of the national electorate, as determined by 5 national public opinion polling organizations, selected by the CPD. The CPD will rely on the advice of a recognized expert or experts in public opinion polling in determining the polls it will rely upon. 15% is a crazy high ask for any party except for the major parties, because they even struggle with just getting 1% of the votes. Now let's put that in perspective. That is 36.6 million votes out of the 244 million eligible voters. And to the people that say it's just a poll, well, the poll should be representative of the population, so it should be as difficult as getting 36.6 million votes. Another fishy thing with the CPD is that they don't tell us what experts or polls they rely upon, which I believe they should show at least a few months after the election so I can actually build trust with what they're doing, not keeping it behind the scenes. But anyways, the last time America saw a third-party candidate on the debate stage was in '92, and it was Ross Perot. He ended up amassing over 19 million votes in the election. But in the next election, he was denied entry to the debate, and they're reasoning, and I quote, that our decision was made on the basis that only President Clinton and Senator Dole had a realistic chance, as set forth in our criteria, to be elected the next president of the United States. To me, this is one of the worst reasons to keep someone off a debate, because you really don't know what's going to happen in the future. Because there's been plenty of times where the impossible has been possible, like the 4-minute mile, for example. But they did have reasonable suspicion that he wouldn't win, but I don't think that's enough for you just to kick someone off a debate. But you may be wondering, do presidential debates even affect voters? Research says no, as the people who watch debates are usually the most politically engaged and are just there to root for the candidate, but can change how undecided voters perceive them. But I feel like the statement is changing with the use of media and content creation, with people just scrolling TikTok or Reels, seeing the debate, and also watching their favorite content creator watch the debate as well. I don't necessarily think they're too politically inclined, so couldn't that be a big market? Which directly affects the younger generations, so you can build a great brand loyalty so they'll vote for your party when they get older, which is a strategy Nike has been employing for years to sell their shoes, and I don't doubt that Democrats or Republicans are trying to do the same thing. So I believe the presidential debates are becoming more influential, and it doesn't hurt just to get your word out as well. So I believe the debate requirements are unreasonable for the amount of influence it has, but with the horrible excuses made by the CPD in the past, I doubt they will change anything. And what's the point of putting an astronomical requirement that only 2 parties can get, other than to exclude all other competition? Oh, and also the Supreme Court thinks the debate requirements are fair as well, which also drives home more that the Supreme Court is biased to the major parties. Our final topic for today is the media, who hasn't been treating third parties the nicest, with constantly calling them spoilers and constantly saying that it's impossible for a third party to win, due to all the reasons I brought up earlier. But why does the media treat third parties so harshly? I believe it's because we have seen only the Democrats or Republicans win so many times, we think that no one could break the system, and will always be a two-party system. And this has led to the media picking sides, constantly forcing their political ideas onto us, and putting us into echo chambers, constantly believing that one side is better than the other. So when a new unfamiliar party comes up, media outlets get worried because they're worried this party will take votes from their party, thus flipping the election. So they will do everything in their power to persuade voters from voting for third parties. And this, I believe, is the number one reason holding third parties back. And I disagree with what the media says about third parties, because I feel like it lacks logic. Calling third party spoilers is unjust, because couldn't you make the same argument that Democrats mess with Republicans' elections? Because in any democracy, there will be a party that messes with another party's election. And I disagree with them saying it's impossible for a third party to win, because throughout history there has been plenty of instances where an underdog has won, like the Patriots in the Revolutionary War and the Republicans in the 1860 election. And with the current divide in American politics, I believe it's entirely possible for a third party to win. It's just crazy to me how just a few lies and doubts from one person online can snowball into something much bigger that can stop the whole world from changing. And now it's time to answer the question, is the US government a monopoly? And under the Supreme Court's own definition, yes, with them being able to exclude competition through the ways listed here. But what I think is stopping third parties is the media and our own beliefs, with us constantly believing that's only a two-party system, when it doesn't have to be. There are plenty of other governments where there are more than 2 parties, and they're benefiting from the competition. Why can't we be the same? Hopefully you learned something in this video. My goal was to get as close to the truth as possible in the amount of time I've had between school, and share it with you guys. But if you saw something I missed or you disagree with, I will gladly debate it with you in the comments. Anyways, have a good day, and see you in the next one.